Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail, not on a luxury cruise, but on a creaking, open longship, facing the icy spray and endless horizons. We're plunging into the raw, unforgiving world of the Viking explorers. Those legendary seafarers often romanticized as horned, helmeted adventurers bravely conquering new lands. Imagine yourself standing on the deck, wind whipping through your hair, the roar of the ocean in your ears, charting a course for unknown shores. Sounds thrilling, doesn't it? The freedom, the glory, the promise of new discoveries. But here's the cheeky reality check: if you were a Viking explorer, you probably wouldn't survive this, with your sanity, your health, or even your life intact. Tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on the gritty, gruesome, and utterly miserable reality of what it was truly like to be one of these famous Norsemen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. From the moment you pushed off from the familiar shores of your fjord, your life as a Viking explorer would be defined by longship life cramped, cold, seasick journeys. Forget any notions of comfortable cabins or even a dry place to stretch out. Your longship, for all its revolutionary design and seaworthiness, was essentially an open boat, a slender vessel of wood and hide that offered little protection from the brutal elements. Imagine cramming yourself onto that deck with dozens of other burly Norsemen. There were no designated sleeping quarters, no private spaces. You'd sleep wherever you could, often curled up beneath a rough wool blanket, exposed to the sky. Personal space was a luxury utterly unknown. You were constantly in close proximity to your shipmates, sharing every breath of stale, salt-laden air. It's like being on the world's longest, coldest, and smell-intensive group camping trip. But on a perpetually rocking bathtub, the cold would be bone-chilling, especially on voyages across the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, or Vinland, North America. The spray from the waves would constantly wash over the deck, soaking your woolen clothes, which would then slowly dry on your body, or worse, remain damp for days. Hypothermia was a constant threat, slowly sapping your energy and your will. Even in summer, the northern seas were frigid, and the biting wind would cut through layers of clothing. And then there was the seasickness. For weeks, sometimes months, you'd be subjected to the relentless pitching and rolling of the open ocean. Imagine the constant nausea, the dry heaves, the inability to keep food down. Even the most seasoned sailors could be struck by it, leaving you weak, dehydrated, and utterly miserable. There was no comfortable place to lie down, no quiet corner to escape the motion. You simply endured it, often vomiting over the side, adding to the general stench of the ship. The lack of sanitation was equally grim, with dozens of men packed together. Personal hygiene was almost non-existent. Waste would be simply tossed overboard, or collected in buckets on deck, only to slosh around in rough seas, the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food, and human waste would become a pervasive, inescapable part of your existence on board. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the sheer discomfort of longship life is the absence of an internal deck or cabins on most Viking longships. These vessels were primarily designed for speed, shallow draft for river navigation, and cargo capacity on the open deck. This open design, while efficient for raiding and exploration, meant that the crew was constantly exposed to the elements. making long voyages a test of extreme endurance. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some sagas mention Vikings fashioning makeshift tents or coverings from their sails when anchored or pulled ashore, offering temporary, flimsy shelter, but nothing permanent or comfortable on the open sea. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep under a damp, flapping canvas. While still shivering, it's a testament to their ingenuity, born of desperation. Historians still argue whether the extreme physical discomfort and hazardous conditions of longship voyages primarily contributed to the high mortality rates among Viking explorers, or if dangers from combat and uncharted territories were more significant. Either way, every journey was a gamble with your comfort, health, and very life, a testament to sheer, unadulterated misery. So, you were perpetually wet, cold, and seasick on that open longship. But what did you even eat to fuel your arduous journey? This brings us to the grim reality of your diet aboard the ship-rancid rations. Scurvy risk. Forget any notion of fresh, varied meals. Your food would be monotonous, barely palatable, and fundamentally lacking in the vital nutrients your body desperately needed to survive long voyages. Imagine your typical meal at sea. It would consist primarily of dried or salted meat, often beef or pork, hardtack, a kind of very hard, dry biscuit made from flour and water, and perhaps some dried fish. These were non-perishable staples, designed to last for weeks or months. But they offered little in the way of flavor or freshness. You'd chew on tough, leathery strips of meat that had been preserved with copious amounts of salt, making you perpetually thirsty for water that might itself be stale or limited. It's like eating nothing but beef jerky and crackers for months on end, with no end in sight. Fresh water was a precious commodity, strictly rationed. You'd carry it in wooden barrels, which over time could develop a foul taste or even grow algae. Imagine taking a sip of water that tastes faintly of old wood and stagnant pond scum, and having to be grateful for it when rain fell. You'd scramble to collect it in sails or buckets, a welcome, albeit temporary, reprieve from the thirst, without refrigeration. Fresh provisions like milk, eggs, or vegetables were impossible to carry for extended periods, the most insidious dietary threat. However, was the risk of scurvy? Without fresh fruits or vegetables, your body would quickly deplete its stores of vitamin C after weeks or months at sea. You'd begin to experience the dreadful symptoms: bleeding gums, loose teeth, extreme fatigue, skin lesions, and eventually, a profound weakness that could lead to death. You wouldn't know it was a lack of a tiny vitamin. You'd just feel yourself slowly wasting away, your body failing you in increasingly horrifying ways. It's a bit like a slow-motion horror movie, where your own diet is the monster. Cooking facilities on a longship were minimal, if they existed at all. Perhaps a simple fire pit on a layer of sand on deck for occasional hot meals when conditions allowed. But mostly, you'd eat your hard, cold rations as they were, the lack of variety, the constant blandness, and the perpetual hunger would take a serious psychological toll. Adding to the general misery of the voyage, one mainstream historical fact that highlights this dietary challenge is the reliance on preserved foods for all long-distance voyages prior to the modern era. Sailors, including Vikings, had no choice but to carry food that wouldn't spoil. This reliance on salted meats and hardtack was universal for centuries, and a primary reason why diseases like scurvy plagued maritime expeditions across the globe. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some sagas mention Vikings eating skyr, a type of fermented dairy product, and dried berries when ashore in new lands. hinting at desperate attempts to vary their diet or combat scurvy on land. Imagine chewing on frozen, shriveled berries, just for that fleeting taste of something fresh. It's a sad culinary highlight. Historians still argue whether scurvy was as prevalent among Viking longship crews as it was among later explorers, given their relatively shorter ocean crossings and more frequent landfalls in some routes. Or if the sagas simply don't record the full extent of the disease's impact. Either way, your stomach and your health would be in a constant state of rebellion, battling against the meager, monotonous, and often dangerous food supply. So, your stomach was rebelling, and your body was slowly starving for vital nutrients. But the misery didn't stop there. Packed together on that longship, your daily existence was one of hygiene and disease-filthy conditions, constant illness, in a world without germ theory, or even basic sanitation. Every cough, every cut, and every shared space became a breeding ground for sickness that could quickly decimate a crew. Imagine the pervasive stench, you and dozens of other men, unwashed for weeks or months, sharing cramped quarters, sweat, seasickness, vomit, stale food, and the general grime of travel would combine to create an overpowering, inescapable odor. There was no fresh water for bathing, only limited supplies for drinking. Your clothes, perpetually damp and salty, would become stiff and itchy, clinging uncomfortably to your skin. It's like living in a portable, human-sized compost heap, slowly fermenting in the salty air. Personal hygiene was a concept largely unknown. You'd use a communal bucket for waste, which would then be emptied over the side, hopefully. Hands would rarely be washed, if at all, leading to rapid contamination after handling raw meat, gutting fish, or tending to minor wounds. You'd simply wipe your hands on your trousers. This lack of basic cleanliness ensured that any bacteria or viruses present would spread like wildfire through the confined space of the ship. Minor cuts, scrapes, or blisters, inevitable during manual labor on a ship, could quickly turn into serious infections without antiseptics or antibiotics. A simple infected wound could lead to fever, gangrene, and amputation, or even progress to a fatal blood infection. Imagine a small splinter causing you to lose a limb, or your life, your body, already weakened by poor diet and constant exposure, was ill-equipped to fight off even common ailments. Diseases like dysentery, the bloody flux, would sweep through the crew, caused by contaminated food or water, leading to severe dehydration and weakness. Respiratory infections, fueled by the cold and damp conditions, would turn a simple cough into bronchitis or pneumonia. Lice and fleas would be constant companions, adding to the discomfort and spreading their own set of skin irritations and diseases. It's a bit like a floating petri dish, designed for maximum microbial propagation. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the impact of disease on voyages is the historical accounts of early explorers, from Vikings to later European navigators, being frequently decimated by illness. While exact figures for Viking voyages are sparse, later accounts, such as those from Columbus's voyages or early colonial expeditions, detail crews suffering debilitating losses from dysentery, scurvy, and other infectious diseases in close quarters. This pattern suggests Viking crews faced similar, if not worse, health crises. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that archaeological finds from Viking settlements sometimes include combs and grooming tools, suggesting that personal cleanliness, or at least the removal of lice, was a recognized though perhaps difficult to maintain at sea practice. Imagine taking a break from steering the ship to meticulously comb through your beard for unwelcome guests. It's a small detail that highlights a constant battle against vermin. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rate on Viking voyages was primarily due to combat injuries and shipwrecks, or if disease, exacerbated by the unsanitary conditions, was the silent, more pervasive killer that claimed the most lives. Either way, every cough and every cut was a terrifying reminder of your extreme vulnerability on the open sea. So, disease was a constant unseen enemy, silently picking off your shipmates. But when you stepped off that longship, you faced a far more overt and terrifying reality: combat and violence, brutal raids, constant danger. The romanticized image of the Viking often overshadows the brutal truth that their expansion, their wealth, and their very way of life were built on a foundation of ruthless aggression, constant warfare, and profound personal risk. Imagine landing on a foreign shore. You weren't there for a friendly trade mission. At least, not initially. Your longship, designed for speed and surprise, would likely be heading for an undefended monastery, a wealthy town, or a vulnerable village. The fear in the eyes of the inhabitants would be palpable, and for good reason. Your arrival meant chaos, destruction, and a fight for your life. It's like being part of a very unwelcome, very violent flash mob, where everyone else is trying to stop you with pointy objects. The combat itself would be savage and unforgiving. You'd wield axes, swords, and spears, engaging in close quarters, fighting against defenders who were often ill-prepared or poorly armed. There was no concept of Geneva Conventions or rules of engagement. Victory often meant slaughter, taking captives, and seizing whatever valuables you could carry. The sounds of battle would be deafening: the clash of steel, the screams of the dying, the shouts of your comrades, and the danger was omnipresent. You could be struck down by a peasant's pitchfork, cut down by a Saxon sword, or pierced by an arrow, even if you survived the initial engagement. You might face a counterattack, or be ambushed as you retreated to your ships. The wounds you sustained, in an era of primitive medicine, were often debilitating or fatal, even if not immediately so. Every raid was a roll of the dice, with your life on the line. Beyond organized raids, violence was often a part of daily life: feuds between families, duels to settle disputes, and the constant threat of rival bands of Vikings meant that even when you weren't on an expedition, you needed to be ready to defend yourself or your family. Life was cheap, and grudges ran deep. One mainstream historical fact that clearly demonstrates this pervasive violence is the archaeological evidence of widespread trauma on Viking-age skeletal remains. Studies of human bones from Viking settlements often show a high incidence of healed and unhealed fractures, sword cuts, and axe wounds, particularly on male skeletons, indicating a life filled with brutal, close-quarters combat. Their bones literally tell a story of violence. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Viking warriors were believed to enter a berserker rage, fighting with almost supernatural fury and seemingly impervious to pain. While modern historians debate the true nature of berserker gang, perhaps induced by drugs or psychological techniques, the very legend speaks to the extreme, almost ritualistic, violence associated with Viking combat. Imagine watching your shipmate suddenly transform into a screaming, unstoppable force of nature. It's both terrifying and inspiring. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for Viking raiding was purely economic, seeking wealth and land, or if it was also driven by cultural values of martial prowess and the pursuit of Hrafen glory in battle, or a complex intertwining of both. Either way, for you, the Viking explorer, violence wasn't just a tactic, it was a way of life, and every engagement was a dance with death. So, You were a master of brutal combat, facing violence on distant shores and perhaps even within your own communities. But even without the clash of steel, your life as a Viking explorer was a constant struggle against the unpredictable fury of nature, forcing you to endure navigating perilous water storms, ice, unknown seas. The ocean itself was a relentless, unforgiving adversary, threatening to swallow your longship and all aboard at any moment. Imagine the sheer terror of a storm in the open North Atlantic. Your longship, for all its graceful design, was a small, open vessel, vulnerable to the towering waves that could easily swamp it. Rain would lash down, driven by gale-force winds, making it impossible to see. Thunder would boom overhead, and lightning would illuminate the churning, black water around you. You'd be scrambling to keep the ship afloat, bailing out water, clinging to the rigging, knowing that one rogue wave could send you to the freezing depths. It's like being on a roller coaster that lasts for days, but if you fall off, you instantly freeze to death. Beyond storms, you faced the insidious threat of ice, on voyages to Greenland or Vinland. Especially in certain seasons, you could encounter massive icebergs, silently drifting mountains of frozen water capable of tearing the hull of your ship apart. Even smaller chunks of drift ice could cause catastrophic damage. You'd be constantly vigilant, straining your eyes against the mist and the waves, knowing that a collision meant certain death in the frigid water. Imagine trying to spot an iceberg in a dense fog, with your life depending on it. And then there were the unknown seas. These were voyages into uncharted territory, with no reliable maps, no lighthouses, and only rudimentary navigational tools. You would rely on the sun and stars when visible, the flight paths of birds, and the subtle changes in ocean currents, the fear of getting lost, of drifting endlessly until supplies ran out, or of encountering monstrous sea creatures in the Viking worldview was a very real psychological burden. Every horizon was a mystery, holding both promise and existential dread. Shipwreck was a constant possibility, beyond storms and ice, hidden reefs, treacherous currents near unfamiliar coastlines, or even structural failure of the ship itself could send you to the bottom. If your ship was lost, your chances of survival in the freezing northern waters would be almost non-existent. Even if you made it to shore, you'd be stranded in a hostile, unknown land, facing starvation or hostile inhabitants. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the danger of these waters is the archaeological discovery of sunken Viking ships in various parts of the North Atlantic, while deliberate scuttling occurred for defensive purposes. Many discovered wrecks suggest catastrophic events like storms or collisions, providing tangible evidence of the perilous nature of their voyages and the frequent loss of life at sea. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that Viking navigators sometimes used a sunstone, possibly a crystal like Iceland's spar, to help locate the sun's position on overcast days, allowing them to navigate even when the sky was cloudy. Imagine relying on a special rock to tell you where you're going when you can't see anything. It's a testament to their ingenuity and desperation in the face of nature's challenges. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' renowned seamanship and ship design primarily allowed them to conquer these dangerous waters with relatively low losses, or if the sagas and archaeological records simply underrepresent the true, devastating scale of shipwrecks and deaths at sea during their expansion. Did they master the waves, or just survive them by sheer luck and brutal attrition? Either way, for you, the Viking explorer, the ocean was not just a pathway to new lands, it was a hungry, unpredictable beast, always waiting to claim its next meal. So, the ocean itself was a constant threat, ready to swallow you whole. But even if you survived its fury, you were still relentlessly battered by the forces of nature, leading to constant exposure to elements frostbite, hypothermia, sunburn, the harsh environments you traversed, from the icy North Atlantic to the barren landscapes of new settlements, offered little respite, leaving your body perpetually vulnerable to the extreme whims of weather. Imagine the relentless cold on those open longships, or even in rudimentary settlements in Iceland or Greenland. Insulation was minimal. Your woolen tunics and furs, while better than nothing, were often damp from sea spray or melting snow, losing much of their insulating power. Your fingers and toes would ache with a deep, penetrating cold, easily leading to frostbite. Imagine the slow, creeping numbness, followed by intense pain as your extremities began to freeze, turning pale and waxy, eventually blackening if the tissue died. Losing fingers or toes to frostbite was a common, gruesome reality, forever marking you as a survivor of the extreme cold. It's like experiencing a never-ending winter camping trip, where the only prize for survival is missing digits. Hypothermia was an even more insidious killer. The constant cold, combined with dampness and exhaustion, would slowly drain your body heat. You'd shiver uncontrollably. Your movements would become clumsy, and your thoughts would grow muddled. Eventually, you'd succumb to a drowsy, peaceful numbness that often preceded death, as your core body temperature dropped too low to sustain life. Many a Viking fell asleep in the snow or on a cold deck, never to wake up. But it wasn't just the cold. Surprisingly, even in the northern latitudes, you could suffer from sunburn after weeks or months at sea. With no overhead deck and only rudimentary head coverings, your skin would be exposed to the relentless glare of the sun reflecting off the water. Your face, neck, and hands would burn, peel, and blister, adding another layer of raw pain and discomfort to your already miserable existence. And remember that salty water drying on your skin that would only intensify the burn, making it feel like sandpaper. The wind was a constant, draining force, whether at sea or on land. The ceaseless wind would whip at your clothes, dry out your skin, and make every outdoor task more difficult. It would sap your body heat and contribute to overall exhaustion. Even simple tasks like lighting a fire or cooking a meal would be a struggle against the invisible, chilling force. One mainstream historical fact that demonstrates the extreme conditions is the archaeological evidence from Viking settlements in Greenland, which reveal that even during the medieval warm period, the climate was still exceptionally harsh. Analysis of bones from these settlements shows signs of severe stress, consistent with a hard life in a cold environment, including bone changes associated with constant exposure and malnutrition. The very ground they settled bore witness to their struggle against the elements. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Viking sagas describe warriors using animal fats or even urine mixed with herbs as crude balms to protect their skin from the elements. Imagine smearing animal grease on your face to prevent windburn. It's a testament to their desperate, often unappetizing, attempts at self-preservation. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' renowned hardiness and adaptation to cold climates primarily allowed them to survive and thrive in these harsh regions, or if their legendary endurance was simply a necessity born from a life of constant exposure and a high tolerance for discomfort and pain. Did they embrace the cold, or just suffer through it better than others? Regardless, your body would be a constant battlefield against the sun, wind, and ice, perpetually bruised and battered by the world you dared to explore. So, your body was a constant battlefield against the elements, often bruised and battered. But when those battles led to injury, your life as a Viking explorer plunged into an even more precarious state, facing medical care and injuries, primitive treatment, lasting pain, in an era without modern medicine, antibiotics, or even a deep understanding of anatomy. Every wound, every broken bone, and every internal ailment was a potentially life-threatening event, leading to agonizing recoveries or permanent disability. Imagine a serious injury in battle. Perhaps an axe blow to the leg, a sword cut to the arm, or an arrow piercing your side. Your comrades might carry you back to the longship or a makeshift camp. There would be no sterile operating room, no anesthetics beyond perhaps a swig of strong ale or a blow to the head to knock you out. The doctor would likely be a local healer, an elder, or simply a comrade with some rudimentary knowledge of herbs and bandages. It's like getting emergency surgery performed by your drunk uncle, using only what he found in his backyard. The treatment itself would be brutal. Wounds would be roughly cleaned, perhaps with water often unboiled, or even urine believed to have antiseptic properties. Though questionable effectiveness, foreign objects like arrowheads might be dug out with unsterilized knives or even fingers. Bleeding would be staunched with moss, cobwebs, or hot iron applied directly to the wound. A horrifying process known as cauterization. The pain would be excruciating, beyond anything you've ever experienced, and would continue long after the initial treatment. Infection, the silent killer, was almost guaranteed. Without antibiotics, even a minor cut could fester into a raging infection, leading to gangrene, a putrid smell, and, eventually, the necessity of amputations, performed with a saw and without proper anesthesia, were horrific, often fatal procedures, leaving you permanently crippled if you survived. Imagine losing a limb, not to the initial blow, but to the invisible enemy festering within your wound. Broken bones would be crudely set, often resulting in misshapen or poorly healed limbs that caused chronic pain and limited mobility for the rest of your life. Head injuries, common in combat, could lead to lasting cognitive impairment, personality changes, or debilitating headaches. You would carry the scars, the limps, and the chronic pain as constant reminders of your perilous life. One mainstream historical fact that chillingly demonstrates the reality of Viking Age medical care is the archaeological evidence of trepanation drilling holes in the skull performed on some Viking skulls. While the success rate varied, the very attempt indicates a desperate, albeit crude, form of neurosurgery, likely to relieve pressure from head injuries or treat mental illness, showing their willingness to attempt extreme measures without modern medical understanding. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Viking sagas mention healers using spider webs as a dressing for wounds, believing the web's stickiness and potential antibacterial properties from certain spiders could aid healing. Imagine having a spider web stuck to your open wound. Definitely not for the faint of heart. It's a small detail that speaks volumes about their desperate ingenuity. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' high pain tolerance, often emphasized in sagas, was primarily a cultural stoicism cultivated from a young age, or if it was simply a necessary adaptation to a world where pain was constant and effective, relief was almost non-existent. Did they genuinely feel less pain? Or just suffer in silence either way? Your body would be a canvas of old scars and chronic aches, a living testament to the brutal inadequacy of medical care in the Viking Age. So, your physical body bore the marks of constant injury and primitive healing. But the dangers weren't only external. The endless journeys into the unknown, the isolation from familiar comforts, and the constant threat of death would take a profound toll on your mind, leading to the severe psychological toll of exploration isolation, fear, desperation. Viking life wasn't just physically brutal, it was a relentless assault on your mental well-being. Imagine the vast, empty expanse of the ocean. For weeks, sometimes months, you would see nothing but the endless horizon and the churning waves. This profound isolation, cut off from family, friends, and the familiar routines of home, could breed a deep sense of loneliness and longing. The camaraderie of your shipmates was a buffer, but even that couldn't fully mitigate the psychological impact of being so utterly disconnected from the known world. It's like being stuck on the world's least luxurious cruise, but everyone else is speaking a language of grunts and sea shanties, and you're not sure if you'll ever see land again. Then there was the omnipresent fear. Fear of storms, fear of icebergs, fear of shipwreck, fear of hostile natives in unknown lands, fear of supernatural beings and sea monsters that populated the Viking worldview. Every creak of the longship, every dark cloud on the horizon, every unfamiliar sound from the deep could trigger a primal terror. This wasn't a fleeting anxiety, it was a constant, low-level hum of dread that permeated your every waking moment, gnawing at your sense of security. And, in the face of these overwhelming dangers, desperation could set in, when supplies ran low, when the weather turned impossibly foul, when a shipmate succumbed to disease, or when you were stranded on a barren shore. A sense of hopelessness could creep in. The struggle for survival would become so overwhelming that the very will to continue could falter. Imagine facing starvation in an uncharted land, with no rescue in sight. What choices would you make then? Sleep, when it came, would likely be fitful and haunted by vivid, disturbing dreams of the sea, of battles, or of home. The lack of proper rest, combined with constant stress, would further erode your mental resilience. Even if you survived the voyage, you might return a changed man, haunted by the horrors you witnessed and the extremities you endured. Perhaps suffering from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. One mainstream historical fact that indirectly points to this psychological toll is the heavy reliance on oral traditions and sagas to recount Viking journeys. These stories, while epic and heroic, often feature moments of profound despair, doubt, and longing for home, suggesting that the reality of their struggles was deeply ingrained in their cultural memory, even when romanticized. The human experience of their journeys shines through the poetic narrative. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Viking crews were said to carry sacred amulets or small effigies of their gods, like Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, not just for religious piety, but perhaps as psychological comforts against the overwhelming fear of the unknown. Imagine clutching a tiny hammer made of lead, hoping it wards off the giant sea serpent you believe lives beneath your ship. It's a small act of self-soothing in a terrifying world. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' stoic cultural facade and emphasis on courage primarily masked profound psychological distress, or if their fatalistic religious beliefs genuinely provided them with a more robust mental resilience against the hardships they faced. Did they truly feel less fear, or just express it differently? Regardless, your mind, as much as your body, would be stretched to its breaking point by the relentless isolation, fear, and desperation of your voyages into the great unknown. So, your mind was stretched thin by the relentless perils of the sea. But even if you survived the voyage and the fight, you faced another grim reality, one that could turn the tables on your entire existence, the constant slavery and captivity risks. For a Viking, the very real danger existed that you, yourself, could be captured, enslaved, and forced into a life of brutality, losing all freedom and social standing, Imagine the sudden reversal of fortune. One moment, you're a fearsome raider. The next, your ship is ambushed, or you're surrounded by overwhelming numbers of local defenders. Perhaps you're captured during a reconnaissance mission ashore, or left behind after a hasty retreat. Your life, once defined by freedom and the pursuit of glory, would instantly transform into one of utter powerlessness. It's like going from being the shark to suddenly being the goldfish. But the goldfish pond is also a very unpleasant prison. Slavery was a pervasive institution in the Viking Age, both for those they conquered and, crucially, for those who were captured by others. If you were taken captive, your captors might be rival Viking groups, Anglo-Saxons, Franks, Slavs, or any of the numerous peoples you encountered. Your fate would be grim. You might be sold into the extensive slave markets that flourished across Europe and beyond, trafficked far from your homeland, never to see your family again. Your life as a thrall, the Old Norse term for a slave, would be one of unremitting toil and harsh treatment. You'd be forced to perform manual labor, often agricultural work, mining, or domestic service, with no rights, no pay, and no hope of escape. Your body would be constantly pushed to its limits, and resistance would be met with severe punishment. Even death. You'd lose your name, your identity, and your place in society. Imagine being reduced to nothing more than property, a tool to be used until you broke. The humiliation and psychological degradation of slavery would be profound. You'd be stripped of your honor, forced to obey those you once considered inferior, and live with the constant threat of violence from your owners. Your status as a free Norseman, a warrior, would be utterly obliterated, replaced by the lowest rung on the social ladder. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this pervasive risk is the widespread evidence of Viking involvement in the slave trade themselves. Vikings were not just raiders, they were also active slave traders, capturing people from the lands they raided, especially Ireland and Britain, and selling them across their vast network, from Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire. This practice meant that the risk of becoming enslaved was a widely understood and accepted part of the violent world they inhabited. They knew the risk because they were also the ones inflicting it. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Viking sagas actually include stories of thralls, often former captives, eventually gaining their freedom, sometimes through exceptional service or even by managing to purchase their liberty. Imagine your one sliver of hope being the incredibly long shot of somehow earning enough to buy yourself back. In a system designed to keep you powerless, it's a rare, almost mythical, pathway to redemption. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of slavery in Viking society primarily contributed to their economic growth by providing cheap labor, or if it was more a consequence of their raiding culture that produced an abundant supply of captives, thus making it an integral part of their social fabric. Was it an economic engine, or a byproduct of violence regardless? For you, the Viking explorer, every encounter with the unknown carried the terrifying potential of losing everything and descending into a life of brutal, dehumanizing servitude. So, the terrifying prospect of becoming a thrall haunted your every step ashore. But even if you avoided capture, stepping onto foreign soil meant immediately facing cultural clashes and hostility violence, mistrust, language barriers. The people you encountered in these new lands were rarely welcoming, and your interactions were often characterized by misunderstanding, suspicion, and outright aggression, turning every new encounter into a potential battle for survival. Imagine landing on a coastline in what would become England or France. The local inhabitants, be they Anglo-Saxons, Franks, or Celts, would see your longship not as a vessel of trade or exploration, but as a harbinger of doom. Their first instinct would be fear, followed quickly by a desperate desire to defend their homes and lives. You were an alien, speaking a guttural language they didn't understand, dressed in unfamiliar attire, and often carrying very large, very sharp axes. It's like being dropped into a hostile video game. But everyone else speaks a different language, and they all want to kill you. The language barrier alone was a massive obstacle. Without a common tongue, communication would be reduced to gestures, threats, and the universal language of violence. Attempts at trade could quickly devolve into armed robbery or bloody conflict due to misunderstandings or outright mistrust. You couldn't simply explain your intentions. Your very presence was often seen as an act of aggression. This mistrust often erupted into violence. Even if your initial intention was to trade or scout, the local population's fear, or your own crew's opportunism, could ignite immediate conflict. You'd be facing organized resistance from local militias or desperate attacks from villagers defending their families. These weren't always glorious battles. They were often messy, desperate skirmishes with high stakes. You would also bring your own cultural biases. You, a proud Norseman, might view the local inhabitants as inferior, weak, or pagan if they were Christian, justifying your acts of violence and plunder. This ethnocentric view, combined with the desperate need for resources, fueled the cycle of hostility. You were part of an invading force, and you were treated as such. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these clashes is the sack of the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 CE. This event is often cited as the beginning of the Viking Age, marking a brutal, unprovoked attack on a sacred, undefended site. It immediately established the Vikings' reputation for savage raids and instilled widespread terror among Christian communities, setting the tone for centuries of violent encounters and profound cultural mistrust. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Viking crews reportedly kept interpreters, sometimes former captives who had learned Old Norse or Vikings who had picked up local dialects, specifically for the purpose of communicating with foreign populations. Imagine your only hope for a peaceful encounter resting on one person who might have a terrible accent or a very limited vocabulary. It's like navigating complex diplomatic relations with only Google Translate. Historians still argue whether the initial Viking raids were primarily opportunistic acts of piracy driven by economic hardship at home, or if they were part of a more organized, deliberate expansion driven by a desire for land and political power, leading to unavoidable cultural clashes. Was it just random violence, or a calculated strategy regardless? For you, the Viking explorer, every new shore was a gamble, and the local inhabitants were more likely to greet you with a weapon than a warm welcome. So, you often met the locals with weapons rather than handshakes, but if you were lucky enough, or tenacious enough, to establish a foothold in these new territories, you'd then face the profound challenges of life in new settlements' harsh winters. Resource scarcity, whether it was the frozen expanse of Greenland or the wooded shores of Vinland. Colonizing these lands was an endless struggle against brutal environments and the constant threat of starvation. Imagine arriving in a place like Greenland. The name sounds appealing, right? Well, that was a bit of a marketing ploy. You'd find vast fjords, but towering ice caps, rocky soil, and a climate far colder and less hospitable than your homeland in Norway. Your first task would be to clear land, build rudimentary shelters, often turf houses for insulation, and quickly establish some means of survival before the harsh northern winter descended. It's like being dropped into a very long, Very cold episode of a survival reality show. But without the cameras or the prize money, the winters would be long, dark, and utterly brutal. Temperatures would plummet far below freezing, and blizzards could rage for days, trapping you indoors. Keeping warm would be a constant battle, requiring immense amounts of firewood, a scarce commodity in some regions, or peat. Imagine huddling around a smoky fire, constantly shivering, watching your breath condense in the frigid air, and praying for spring to arrive. Resource scarcity was a pervasive issue. The thin, rocky soil in places like Greenland made large-scale agriculture challenging. Limiting your ability to grow grain or raise livestock beyond a subsistence level, you'd become heavily reliant on hunting and fishing, seals, walruses, fish, and caribou. But these resources could fluctuate, and successful hunts were never guaranteed. One bad hunting season, or a particularly severe winter, could mean widespread starvation for the entire settlement. You'd be living on the edge, always one step away from hunger. Building materials were also limited. Good timber was scarce in treeless regions like parts of Greenland, forcing you to rely on driftwood or import wood at great cost. Iron, too, would be precious. Requiring trade or arduous journeys back to Scandinavia, every tool, every nail, every piece of metal was a valuable commodity, not easily replaced. The isolation from your homeland added another layer of difficulty. Resupply ships might only arrive once a year, or not at all if conditions were too harsh. You were largely on your own, dependent entirely on your own ingenuity and the meager resources of the new land. One mainstream historical fact that chillingly illustrates this struggle is the eventual abandonment of the Norse settlements in Greenland around the 15th century. While the precise reasons are still debated, climate change leading to colder temperatures and increased ice, combined with environmental degradation from their own farming practices and declining trade with Norway, made the settlements unsustainable. They simply couldn't outlast the environment. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that archaeological excavations in Greenland Norse settlements have found evidence of them eating marine mammals like seals and even polar bears, suggesting their diet shifted dramatically to whatever was available when traditional farming methods failed. Imagine enduring a diet of mostly seal blubber and tough polar bear meat, just to survive another season. It's a testament to their desperation and adaptability. Historians still argue whether the Norse failed in Greenland primarily due to their inability to adapt fully to the Inuit way of life and resource management, or if external factors like the Little Ice Age and the decline of European trade routes were the ultimate undoing of their settlements. Was it their stubbornness, or just bad luck with the climate regardless? For you, a Viking colonist, life in these new lands was a relentless, grinding test of survival, where every winter was a threat and every resource a hard-won victory. So, simply surviving the harsh winters and scarcity of new lands was a monumental feat. But even within established Viking society, whether in new settlements or back home, your life was rigidly defined by a stark social hierarchy and brutality thralls. Carls, Jarls, you were a cog in a strict social machine where your birth largely dictated your destiny, and the threat of violence and subjugation was a constant undercurrent, especially for those at the bottom. Imagine the social ladder you stood on. At the very bottom were the thralls, the slaves. These were often captured individuals from raids, or their descendants. Their lives were utterly miserable. They owned nothing, could be bought and sold like cattle, and were subjected to the whims of their masters. Their work was the hardest, most dangerous, and most demeaning quarrying stone, hauling timber, or serving endlessly in the household. They had no legal rights, no personal freedom, and their very existence was one of constant degradation and potential violence. If you were a thrall, your life was a living hell, and escape was almost impossible. It's like being trapped in a permanent, brutal internship with no pay, no holidays, and no hope of promotion. Above the thralls were the carls, the free farmers, artisans, and tradesmen. This was likely your status if you weren't a thrall or a chieftain. You owned your own land if you had any, your own tools, and could participate in the thing the local assembly or parliament. You had rights, but your life was still one of relentless toil. You worked the land, tended livestock, fished, or practiced your craft, all to provide for your family and pay any taxes or dues to the local chieftain. While free, you were constantly vulnerable to raids from other Vikings, demands from your local jarl, or the vagaries of the weather. Your freedom was hard-won and perpetually precarious. At the top were the jarls, the chieftains, nobles, and powerful warlords. These were the elite, often wealthy landowners who commanded loyalty through their military prowess, their lineage, and their generosity in gifting spoils from raids. They owned vast estates, thralls, and often a longship. They were the leaders of expeditions, the arbiters of justice or injustice, and the most powerful figures in any community. Their lives, while privileged, were also filled with the constant need to maintain power, put down rivals, and lead their followers in successful ventures. They might live in grand halls, but their lives were still bound by the constant threat of violent overthrow. This rigid hierarchy meant that upward mobility was incredibly rare. A thrall might occasionally gain freedom, but it was exceptional. A carl could gain wealth and influence through successful raiding, but becoming a jarl required a level of military success, land ownership, and followers that was beyond most. Your place was largely determined at birth, and it was brutal if you were born low. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this social structure is the detailed descriptions of these three social classes, thrall, carl, jarl, in the Rigstula poem, an Old Norse Eddic poem that describes the god Rieger Heimdall visiting human homes and establishing the three social orders. While a mythical account, it reflects the deeply ingrained and widely accepted nature of this rigid class system in Viking society. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that even among the thralls, there was a pecking order, with domestic thralls often having slightly better conditions than field thralls. Though still enslaved, imagine a social ladder within hell itself. It's a grim reminder of the pervasive nature of their social stratification. Historians still argue whether the Viking social hierarchy, particularly the widespread institution of slavery, was primarily a pragmatic response to the economic opportunities presented by raiding and conquest, or if it was deeply rooted in pre-existing Germanic social traditions that viewed certain groups as inherently inferior or destined for servitude. Was it just economic exploitation, or ancient tradition regardless? Your life as a Viking was inextricably tied to your birthright and your social standing, a constant reminder that, for many, life was a brutal struggle just to avoid the lowest rung of a very unforgiving ladder. So, your place in Viking society was rigidly defined, a constant struggle within a brutal hierarchy. This harsh reality, coupled with the myriad dangers you faced, instilled a deep sense of resignation, heavily influenced by your religious beliefs and fatalism gods, fates, Valhalla. Your worldview was shaped by a pantheon of powerful, often capricious gods, and a profound acceptance that your ultimate destiny, including your death, was already woven into the fabric of the universe, leading to a unique blend of stoicism and daring. Imagine your spiritual landscape, You didn't worship a single, all-powerful, benevolent deity. Instead, you honored a pantheon of gods and goddesses like Odin, the All-Father of wisdom and war, Thor, the Thunderer, protector of humanity, and Freya, goddess of love, fertility, and battle. These gods were powerful, but also flawed, engaged in their own cosmic struggles, and not always predictable. They were not distant, but intimately involved in the world, influencing battles, harvests, and even personal fortunes. It's like living in a world where the Greek pantheon runs your local weather and warfare reports, and they might just decide to smite you on a whim. Central to your belief system was the concept of fate or weird. Your destiny was believed to be preordained, woven by the Norns' female deities of fate at your birth. This didn't mean you were passive. A true Viking was expected to act bravely, to strive for glory, and to meet their fate with courage. But ultimately, whether you lived or died, succeeded or failed, was believed to be beyond your ultimate control. This fatalism, while seemingly grim, could also be liberating, allowing you to face terrifying dangers with a grim resolve, knowing that if it was your time to die, then so be it. The most coveted afterlife, especially for warriors, was Valhalla, Odin's great hall in Asgard. To enter Valhalla, you had to die bravely in battle, a glorious end that promised an eternity of feasting, drinking, and perpetual combat practice, awaiting the final battle of Ragnarok. This belief provided a powerful incentive for fearless behavior in combat and during perilous voyages. Dying an ignoble death, from old age or illness in your bed, was considered far less desirable. Imagine trying to get a glorious death, not just because you're brave, but because you literally want a better post-life party. You would perform rituals and offer sacrifices to appease the gods, seeking their favor before a raid, a voyage, or a harvest. These acts weren't about changing your ultimate fate, but perhaps about influencing the path to it, or ensuring the gods looked favorably upon your courage and piety. You understood that the gods could be cruel, but also that they respected strength and daring. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this fatalism is the practice of human and animal sacrifice at major Blot's sacrificial feasts, described in historical accounts like Adam of Bremen's, while controversial and debated in its extent. The very idea of offering lives to the gods suggests a profound belief in their power and influence over fate, and a desperate desire to secure their favor for the community or for a glorious death in battle. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Viking warriors were said to have battle frenzy or hamingja, a kind of spiritual luck or protective spirit, which was sometimes believed to be hereditary. Imagine believing that your ancestors' luck in battle was literally passed down to you, influencing your chances on the battlefield. It's like having a built-in lucky charm, but it's part of your soul. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' fatalistic worldview primarily contributed to their daring and fearless exploration and raiding, or if it was more a philosophical coping mechanism for a life filled with unavoidable hardship, violence, and uncertainty. Did it make them brave, or just resigned regardless? Your spiritual world was as harsh and uncompromising as your physical one, a constant reminder that your life was but a thread in the grand, predestined tapestry woven by the fates. So, your belief in fate, gods, and Valhalla shaped your spiritual resilience, but this fatalism also tied into a grim practical reality: the lack of long-term security, short lives. Constant threat in the Viking Age. The concept of a comfortable retirement, of growing old gracefully, or even of a consistently peaceful existence, was largely a foreign one. Your life was a precarious gamble. constantly under threat from myriad dangers, making long-term planning a luxury few could afford. Imagine your future prospects. Old age, if you were lucky enough to reach it, was often a period of diminished capacity and increasing vulnerability. Your body, ravaged by constant physical labor, battle injuries, and exposure to the elements, would be a collection of aches, pains, and chronic conditions. There were no pensions, no widespread social safety nets beyond your immediate family, or perhaps your chieftain's generosity if you were particularly favored. If you couldn't work, you often became a burden, relying on the goodwill of others. It's like living in a society where everyone's retirement plan is simply don't die young. The average lifespan was significantly shorter than today. While some sagas tell of revered elders, the reality for most was a life cut short by disease, famine, accident, or, most commonly for a Viking explorer, violence. You might die during a raid, drowned in a shipwreck, succumb to infection from a wound, or simply waste away from the countless illnesses that plagued the unhygienic medieval world. The constant threat wasn't just a figure of speech. It was the inescapable reality of your daily existence. Even when not actively raiding or exploring, your homeland was still dangerous. Inter-clan feuds, political assassinations, and local skirmishes were common. Your farm could be raided by rivals, your family attacked, or your meager possessions stolen. There was no overarching state or police force to guarantee your safety. You were always, in some sense, on your guard, ready to defend yourself and your kin. The constant need for resources also fueled this insecurity. A bad harvest, a decline in fish stocks, or a lack of successful raids could quickly lead to food shortages and widespread hardship. Economic stability was fleeting, dependent on unpredictable factors like weather and the success of dangerous expeditions. You lived in a state of perpetual scarcity, always one step away from hunger or destitution. One mainstream historical fact that starkly illustrates this lack of long-term security is the high infant and child mortality rates during the Viking Age. Archaeological evidence from burial sites consistently shows that a significant portion of the population did not survive past childhood. This grim reality meant that even if you survived, the emotional toll of losing children would be a common and devastating experience, further emphasizing the precariousness of life itself. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Viking burial sites include symbolic objects, like miniature ships, suggesting a belief in continuing journeys even in death. Perhaps a final hope for a peaceful voyage after a life of constant peril. Imagine planning your eternal journey to be calmer than your mortal one. It's a poignant reflection of their aspirations for rest. Historians still argue whether the Viking Age society's emphasis on short-term glory and daring exploits was primarily a cultural preference for heroism, or if it was a direct consequence of a world where long-term security was genuinely unattainable. Making living boldly the most rational approach. Did they choose to live fast, or was it their only option? Regardless, for you, the Viking explorer, the future was an uncertain, often bleak prospect, and every day you survived was a testament to your hardiness and sheer luck in a world that offered few guarantees beyond the certainty of danger. So, your future was uncertain, your life a constant gamble against peril. This leads us to the overarching truth of your existence as a Viking explorer, the grinding daily struggle, endless toil, few comforts, beyond the dramatic raids and epic voyages. The mundane reality of Viking life, even when not actively exploring, was one of relentless physical labor, persistent discomfort, and a stark absence of the luxuries and conveniences we take for granted today. Imagine a normal day, When you weren't on a longship or battling, if you were a Carl, a free farmer, your day would begin before dawn. You'd tend to your crops in often rocky, unyielding soil, or manage your livestock, which required constant vigilance against predators and the elements. Every task, from plowing to harvesting, from milking cows to shearing sheep, was performed manually, with simple, heavy tools. Your muscles would ache constantly, your hands would be calloused and cracked, and your back would groan from the repetitive strain. It's like living a permanent CrossFit workout, but with no gym membership, and the only prize is staying alive. Your home, likely a longhouse shared with your family and perhaps even your livestock during winter, would offer basic shelter but little comfort. It would be dimly lit by firelight and perhaps a few small openings, often smoky from the central hearth, and perpetually cool. Sanitation would be rudimentary, and privacy non-existent. You'd sleep on straw or furs, sharing warmth with your family and animals. Imagine the pervasive smell of smoke, damp earth, and farm animals, a constant aroma that would cling to your clothes and hair. Food, even when available, was simple and repetitive porridge, coarse bread, salted meat, dried fish, and perhaps some root vegetables if the harvest was good. Sweet treats were rare, spices almost non-existent. You ate to survive, not for pleasure. Every meal was a reminder of the constant effort required to produce it. Leisure time was scarce and generally involved practical pursuits like crafting tools, repairing equipment, or storytelling. There were no elaborate entertainments on demand, no soft chairs to recline in, and no ready access to warmth or light outside the hearth. Every comfort was hard-won, every moment of rest a precious, brief reprieve from the grind. Even the simplest acts, like fetching water, preparing food, or maintaining your meager possessions, required significant physical effort. Life was fundamentally about brute force application against a resistant world. The heroic sagas often overlook the sheer exhaustion that was the backdrop to every Viking's existence. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this daily grind is the archaeological evidence of extensive bone wear and tear on Viking-age skeletons, particularly in the spine and joints. This physical evidence points directly to lives characterized by heavy manual labor, often starting from a young age, indicating that the chronic physical toll was a universal aspect of their existence, not just for warriors. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Viking homes had a sleep platform built along the walls, elevated slightly above the floor, which might have been filled with straw or furs. Imagine your bed being essentially a slightly raised pile of hay, shared with everyone else in the house. It's a testament to the simplicity and lack of comfort in their daily living arrangements. Historians still argue whether the apparent stoicism and hardiness of the Viking people was primarily a result of their brutal environment and grinding daily struggle, forcing them to adapt or perish, or if it was a deep-seated cultural value that was instilled from birth regardless of circumstance. Did they have to be tough, or did they just value toughness? Regardless, your life as a Viking explorer, at home or abroad, was an endless testament to human endurance, a constant battle against the elements, scarcity, and the unyielding demands of a truly harsh world. Now, let the clang of axes, the roar of the sea, and the biting chill of the northern winds gently recede. The image of the longship fades, the smoky longhouse softens, and the aches in your imaginary bones loosen into a distant hum. There's no more desperate foraging, no more constant threat of a raiding party, no more unforgiving daily toil here. Just the quiet hum of your fan, the soft comfort of your bed, and the profound stillness of the night. You can release the imagined burdens of that hard Viking life, the weary body, the constant dangers, and the relentless struggle. That demanding existence, with all its grit and grime, belongs to history, not to your peaceful present. Drift now into a deep, untroubled rest. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.